As I mentioned in my Mortal Kombat review, I truly have a tremendous obsession with Resident Evil as a whole. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was the first game that I ever played on my PlayStation 1, due to a lot of time spent on my cousin's house just watching him doing countless playthroughs that always kept me intrigued until later I tried it myself. After completing it at a very young age, as years went by, these games became a part of my life and I grew up addicted to each one in its own way. I never hated the change of tone when it comes to the more action-oriented games. In fact, I always loved the goofiness in its story and the over-the-top action. Of course, I prefer my puzzles in the Spencer Mansion or in Raccoon City, but I never minded the change. With the arrival of the new Village game that I can't stop playing, and the fact that there's a new animated series and a weird movie coming out soon, I finally gained the courage to dive into something that I've come close to pretty much hate, being the Paul W.S. Anderson adaptations. These movies are a mess, carried by a protagonist that pretty much bashes every other character introduced from the games and turns them into secondary people that either die or are reduced to pioneers of her actions. So, without further ado, let's start off with the worst of all. Resident Evil: The Final Chapter. After the ending of the previous film, I expected it to be massive, but instead what I got was an empty circus with only one clown to make me laugh, and not for the good reasons. The majority of the characters introduced from the games are presumed dead by the time the first act ends, and the story follows Alice as she pretty much arrives at places and becomes the leader no matter what. We meet new characters that I don't even remember their names, and the events that happen are so ludicrous and weird. The editing in this movie is catastrophic. The quick cuts are anxiety inducing and made me feel sick. Felt like I was watching Mad Max on drugs, and even if it was the case, that would feel like a much better movie than this one. Mad Max is phenomenal, and I'm mentioning it because after a long sequence of lame jump scares, this movie has a scene that is similar to Mad Max in many ways, but if they gave the director some hallucinogenic and the editor was drunk. Also, the music is always trying to make this movie sound epic, when it just made me feel uncomfortable, especially at the end. Oh boy, that ending. The big twist that everyone talks about, that totally bashes the main character. Anyway, this movie is a no-no for me. Number 5, Resident Evil Afterlife. First of all, they completely chop off the interesting build-up that they did in the previous entry, leading to the introduction of this movie, and instead we have the main character searching for the promised land. Chris Redfield is in this movie, and he meets with Claire Redfield, which is something cool to see. The other characters are somehow enjoyable and the location they are in serves to some good tension. The problem is that they abandon the horror part and shove on our faces the really bad CGI with the try-hard on the 3D technology. I mean, this movie has some great shots, but when it comes to visual effects, it's hideous. Resident Evil Retribution. This one I can say that at least isn't full of quick cuts and it has a certain aesthetic present in the fights. My problem with this entry is how fabricated the story is when going from point A to point B. After the events of the previous movie, this one feels so disconnected from the rest, and its structure feels very odd because of the setting itself. The characters are in this facility with different rooms that recreate cities or other zones, and it plays a bit with clones that represent characters from the past, and it's just laughable, especially their interactions. It's entertaining to see some characters like Barry, Leon S. Kennedy and Ada, but they don't feel like the characters in the games. Honestly, I don't feel the writers played any Resident Evil to see how they really are. In number 3 we got Resident Evil Extinction. This film, in my opinion, initiated a completely different route when it comes to how this cinematic universe will deviate from what the games are. It sets up a revolution of Alice clones that, as goofy as it seems, I wouldn't mind at this point. This third entry has great elements. The western vibe works fine, and here characters are desperate. I wish I've seen a standalone movie with Ali Leiter as Claire in Raccoon City, because I think she does a great job as this leader that has to make decisions in order to keep the group safe. But again, the film tries hard to sound badass, and instead of giving time to characters so they can shine, it goes back to center the attention on Alice, and it's just cringe-worthy. Number 2, Resident Evil 1. Funny enough, the first time I came across this one, it was playing on TV, and I had no idea it was a Resident Evil movie. I started watching when they were next to the containers and the first zombies began to appear. I actually enjoyed it, and I'd say that here, since there are no characters from the games, this movie feels natural in terms of story. It isn't perfect, but it tries to have a narrative with some twists presented as its own universe, without tearing apart other stuff that players like from the franchise. It also takes place below a mansion, which brings claustrophobia and serves to some uneasy moments. But if Resident Evil 1 has claustrophobia, Resident Evil 2 lacks on it, but it's rich in atmosphere and tone. This movie pays tribute to the old games in a lot of aspects that, on the simplest of details, are awesome. For example, Jill Valentine walking on a long hallway, the group on a school that is revealed to be full of zombie kids, the opening scene with Jill Valentine, the Nemesis sequences, taking aside the last one, the introduction of Carlos and the SWAT teams on the streets killing zombies, and the final bombing scene. This one I'm putting in the first place because even if the story isn't perfect, it's a funnier movie to watch because of those elements, but in the end it comes out as a mess. Resident Evil in general is full of goofiness in its stories, but you can tell that the games are self-aware about it. These movies don't. They try really hard to sound serious and it comes out as pretentious. I'm all for changing stuff from the source material, but only with one rule. When adapting an art form to another, you can change whatever you want, but it's imperative that you follow the tropes of who these characters are and do a cohesive story with it. For example, as I mentioned, the first movie as a story worked well because it felt like a standalone story, without characters from the games. Resident Evil 2 is my favorite because of the potential on the screen. I love to watch this movie and just imagine how good it would be if Alice wasn't on the picture. In the future, I'm also gonna cover the 3 animated films that I actually like, and I'll jump into the reasons why they're way better than this weird adaptation of the games. So stay tuned to that. With that being said, let me know your thoughts on these movies. Are you excited for the new Resident Evil movie and series? Also, what's your favorite Resident Evil game? Leave a comment down below, and if you like what I do here, consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next video. See ya.